Hey, before this story begins, as the title says, or implies, this story is set in Germany. There are some characters that are supposed to have accents. I tried as hard as I could to learn to do a German accent. I was not capable of it at this time. So I apologize. I won't be doing any German accents. So when it says has a great accent, I didn't want you all to be, where's the accent? So unfortunately, I'm sorry about that. Hope you enjoy the story regardless. October 11th, 1924, Flensburg, Germany. My name is Frederick Fritz Keller. In the following entry, I'll report on my experiences on October 11th and 12th, 1924. I was standing at the port of Flensburg. My pocket watch showed me that it was 11:30 noon, half an hour before my ship left for the crossing to England. Business was taking me there. These were turbulent times in Germany, and another foothold in the UK certainly wouldn't do me any harm. The weather was grey, foggy, and drizzling. Occasionally, I heard a seagull cry out, and the water lapped steadily against the harbor basin. I put my watch back in my suit pocket and looked at the other passengers on Pier 4A. The pretty young woman, wearing a brown coat and a wide hat, radiated a certain elegance. For a moment, she noticed me looking at her. My gaze shifted to the next supposed passenger. A sturdy man with a slouch hat and a cigarette in his mouth was leaning against a post and avoiding my gaze.
Do you always look at your fellow human beings in such a derogatory way?
The lady asked me in a reproachful tone. Up close, I noticed the curls that were sticking out from under her hat. No, good lady, I merely have a penchant for observation.
Nicely put,
He replied snappishly. Frederick Keller, but you can call me Fritz. I held out my hand to her. She looked at me for a moment, and I almost thought she was going to humiliate me by leaving my gesture unanswered.
Margaret Harper.
She shook my hand very curiously.
You're a businessman?
If by that you mean I make a lot of money, that's true. She rolled her eyes. At that moment, a man stepped out of the fog. He was wearing a captain's cap and had a puffy white beard. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you to our crossing to England. I'm your captain, Joseph Bildman. If I can do anything for you, just come and see me. He spoke in a strong East Frisian accent. With a hard, rough hand gesture, he pointed to a boy, perhaps 16 or 17 years old. This is my sailor, Hans Junker, and behind us is the good old sloop. The young man looked visibly nervous, and my gaze wandered to the ship on the quay. Excuse me, is that supposed to be the ship? Where are the other passengers anyway? I asked indignantly. The small ship only had a small lower deck and a tiny bridge. Passenger air travel is taking up our space. Admittedly, they are faster and more practical than my old ship. I'm glad that some people still travel on my ship at all, otherwise I can hang up my hat soon. Frankly, I would have opted for an airship too. My last-minute decision to go to Flensburg got me into this mess. One beautiful night with a pretty lady, and I paid for it with a crossing on this floating plank. The captain checked our tickets, and we made our way to the lower level of the ship. It cracked and creaked as I descended the few steps. There were 4 tables downstairs, each with 2 benches nailed down. I sat down right next to a porthole and looked out. The 2 other passengers did the same, but each at a different table. The ship picked up speed, and soon we had left the harbor behind us. Hans Junker, the sailor, walked down. Squire, I called out and waved him over. A scotch, please, on the rocks, if that's possible here. I slid him a bill. He looked at me in confusion. I'm sorry, sir, I'm afraid we don't have any scotch. Then what do you have? Water, he said. I fumbled around for my cigarette case, but realized that I had obviously left it on the bedside table during my late-night appointment. Buried my face in my hands and groaned out loud. This couldn't be true. Behind me, I heard Margaret Harper giggling softly.
Well, dear Fritz, I guess you can't buy everything, can you?
She laughed, but her laughter stopped when she looked through the porthole next to the scowling man.
Wait a minute. Do you see that?
She asked. Something could be seen far away in the fog, a kind of lightning in the distance. It looked like a large cloud, only directed above the sea. A fountain of rain was pouring over the strange spectacle. The 2 passengers looked out of the porthole in amazement. What is it, Maggie? Afraid of a bit of a storm?
Don't call me Maggie. But no, it's not that. It's...
She fell silent and looked out again, and I suddenly realized it too. Night had fallen. It was pitch black outside, although my watch was now telling me 2 o'clock at noon and none of us had noticed. Strange. I called the sailor again and asked him what this weather phenomenon was all about. He just stammered that it was his first trip and that he was still in nautical school. I sighed and sat down again. I passed the time reading the local newspaper in Flensburg. Maggie was now sitting next to the strange man and looking into the distance. "You can't see anything anymore. It's far too foggy," I said skeptically, noticing that the fog was so thick that the waves lashing against the railing were barely visible. After an hour or so, it happened. A bang sounded with a jolt. I slammed into the table. My rib ached and I saw Maggie adjusting her hat again. "Everybody, wake up! We've run aground!" shouted the captain. This couldn't be true. Who had given this idiot permission to carry passengers? When we arrived to the upper deck, we saw the captain looking over the railing.
Where are we?
Asked Maggie. The fog was so thick that we could barely see our hands in front of our eyes. "Looks like we've run aground on a flat. There seems to be sand down there." Suddenly, there was a creaking noise. It sounded like a rumbling laugh from the fog. I felt goosebumps rise under my shirt. "Hello? Who's there? Have we run aground on silt?" The captain called down. The laughter grew louder, and slowly I recognized a small rowing boat, on which sat an old man with a yellow rain jacket and a wry look. "Ishbal," he shouted, laughing and coughing.
Ishbal?
Maggie asked, confused. "Never heard of it," replied the captain.
Are you alright?
Maggie called down, but the man just laughed and continued to shout that strange word. The fog lifted a little and we realized that our ship was approaching a small island. A small beach and some grasses were visible. A single seagull cried out and circled our ship. Confused, the captain looked at his nautical charts. According to him, there shouldn't be an island in that place. We must have lost our way. "This damn fog," the captain grumbled. "The fog? Have you never sailed in fog before? I can't believe what's happening here. Believe me, this will be your last trip," I shouted at the captain. "Now calm the hell down. Let's go to the island and have a look around. Some ship will leave from here." The sailor laid out the plank, and soon we were standing on the beach of the remote island. We left the ship behind us, and if someone didn't come to our aid soon, the captain said the lower deck would be filled with water. The strange man's laughter disappeared into the distance. Creepy. I still remember his face distorted in the fog. His right eye was closed all the way, and his left was staring madly at us. My next goal was to find a new crossing point as quickly as possible. I walked alongside Maggie on the beach. She lifted her coat so that it didn't get wet or soiled with sand. But what started as a light drizzle slowly turned into a real downpour. "What brings you to England, Maggie?"
You're a rude man. My name is Margaret, and I'm English, if you must know. I'm visiting my family.
Just as I was about to say something, the sailor spoke up. "There's something there. A light." Indeed, a house. No, 2, 3. A small chapel and even a lighthouse. There was a small settlement and a wooden dock was also visible. Thank goodness. Now all that remained was for a ship to set sail from this cursed place. The door to the house right by the dock opened.
Hello? Is anyone there?
A female voice called out. "We're shipwrecked," shouted the captain. We wandered through the sand up to the dock. The figure turned out to be a young woman. She had long reddish hair and wore a simple blouse with a skirt.
By God, get into the warmth quickly. The rain must be getting heavier,
She said. Without thinking twice, I followed the beautiful lady, and we found ourselves in a pub. Old, rustic, and almost everything here was made of wood, with the exception of the clay mugs for the beer. There was no classic tap. The tall landlord fetched the beer and food from a back room. I was overcome with unease as the pot-bellied landlord scrutinized me. A pastor was sitting in a corner with a bowl of stew. His eyes followed us. A slight shiver ran down my spine when I saw him. He had a sinister expression and sleepless, wide-open eyes. "Shipwrecked?" the innkeeper asked. Indeed, we'd like to take the next ship to England, I said immediately. The innkeeper laughed and wiped his hands on his dirty apron. Huh, to England? Nothing goes to England from here. Every now and then a ship comes from the mainland, if you're lucky. And when will this ship come? I asked. Given the weather, definitely not until tomorrow morning. Fantastic. I dropped onto a bar stool and banged my fist on the counter. Isn't there a ship here? Asked Joseph, the captain. An old sailing ship at the harbor. Tell me, do you want something to eat now? Otherwise, get out of here, replied the innkeeper.
Henrik!
Shouted a woman's voice from the back room. A housewife came out with a few bowls of stew. She incomprehensibly whispered something in her husband's ear without taking her eyes off us. Look how they're dressed. Are you going to give them something for nothing? The landlord asked.
That's all right, Henrik. Write it on the lid,
Interjected the woman with the red hair. That's very kind of you, dear lady, but actually I just want to get back to the mainland as quickly as possible, I explained. After a brief discussion, the captain agreed to look after the sailing ship with Hans, the sailor. We stayed in the inn for the time being and ate the terribly slimy soup from old bowls. What's your name anyway? I asked the woman with the red hair.
Emma Corber. And excuse me for being so unfriendly. We're not used to visitors here in Hurspool.
One by one we introduced ourselves and I learned that our mute passenger was called Maximilian Bauer. About 60 people lived on the island called Hurspool. I noticed that Emma was probably the best dressed of them all. The landlord, Henrik Ballas, wore an old apron with dirty trousers, and his wife, Henriette, wore very old-fashioned clothes that were also extremely dirty. I lost my appetite in this store, but I was glued to Emma's lips. She told me that she was from Hamburg and had been living here for a year to help her grandfather. He was a lighthouse keeper and very old. I cast a flattering look into Emma's eyes, and she slowly brushed her silky hair behind her ears. Maggie rolled her eyes again. I was torn from my thoughts when something tugged at my suit. A little boy was standing next to me. He was holding a ceramic toy horse.
Are you playing with me?
The child asked me. I've never been particularly good at dealing with children. I straightened my suit and looked around questioningly when the landlady called out to the boy.
Tjark, get away from the strangers.
Maggie turned to the child and turned her attention to him.
It's all right.
Maggie replied, but Henriette Ballhaus watched uneasily as Maggie played with him. A brief smile came over me when I saw Maggie and little Tjark having fun. She must be a good mother.
Speaking of the lighthouse, were there no lights on?
Emma interrupted the moment. I shook my head. She looked out of the window, a little worried, the rain pattering a little harder against the panes. On the other side, I suddenly saw a scary face. I was startled when I realized it was the pastor, standing behind us without warning, his face reflected in the window. By God, you scared the life out of me. You shouldn't be here, he murmured ominously, turned around and opened the door to the outside. As he left the room, he looked at me with a stare and whispered, Dinner. It was getting too scary for me. Everyone was unfriendly and dirty. The soup tasted disgusting, and I didn't even want to think about spending the night in this place.
Excuse me, Father Wilde is very pious. If I haven't been to church on a Sunday, he won't let me forget it for the rest of the week. It's best if you just ignore him. I'll go and check on my grandfather. I'm getting worried.
A night in bed in this parlor might have been a horror to me, but the idea of Emma Corber made me feel better. I got up and left the disgusting stew behind. Don't worry, I'm coming with you. Without saying a word, Maximilian followed us too. Unlike me and Maggie, he ate the whole stew as if it had been his last meal.
Oh, wait a minute. Where are you going?
Maggie asked as she looked up from Tjark. To the lighthouse, I explained. Maggie turned away from Tjark and promised to come back to play. He tousled his curly hair and left the restaurant with us. Outside, I smiled at Maggie. Did you miss me? I asked coquettishly.
Oh, stop that nonsense. Haven't you noticed? There's something wrong with the people here. Ever since we got here, I had this strange feeling. I certainly don't want to be alone with them.
She whispered to me. I had to admit that I also had a queasy feeling, but I thought it was due to the unusual situation. I looked at Emma and Maximilian, who were walking a few meters ahead of us. Once the captain has sorted everything out with the sailing ship, we will certainly be leaving here, although I'm a little worried about our mute friend up ahead.
Well, maybe they're getting jealous because he's talking to Emma.
I blushed, but I actually heard him speak to her in a low voice for the first time.
Well, Mr. Keller, just watching is probably not enough.
With this remark, she walked a few meters forward. A dark booming sound came from the distance, as if the wind had carried it to us. Maggie stopped for a moment and looked at me with fear in her eyes. Whatever was going on this island, it wasn't right. The gloomy lighthouse was now almost in front of us. The rain soaked almost my entire suit, and the fog crawled like a snake between the half-timbered houses. My watch now read 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It was still pitch black. Emma knocked on the door of the lighthouse.
Grandpa, are you alright?
No response. Emma called out again and knocked louder. Her hand began to tremble. Maximilian gently grabbed her shoulder and gestured for her to make way. With a push, he slammed his upper body against the door and it tore off its hinges. Maggie looked at him in awe, but Emma immediately went into the dark tower. It smelled musty inside and no light was on. Emma lit a small kerosene lamp and walked up the stairs. Silence reigned in the tower. Only the pattering of rain could be heard. My heart leapt when we heard a pitiful groan. My hand and Maggie's were suddenly clasped tightly, but we let go just as quickly.
By God, Grandpa!
Emma rushed up and we followed her. There were a large pile of burnt wood at the head of the lighthouse. Apparently, this island was not supplied with enough oil for the lighthouse. There were open books and papers lying around on the floor, with an old man crouching next to it, holding a book with a black cover in his hand. Emma screamed in horror and knelt down next to him. Bro, halt, vata. The man groaned and kept repeating sounds that sounded like a language completely foreign to me. I immediately grabbed a carafe of water and handed it to Emma. She slowly poured him the water. I had never seen a man so old. He had to be at least 90 years old. Mr. Corber, what happened? I asked him. He just groaned and dropped the book. I recoiled from him when I saw his eyes. He had that strange, crazed look like the confused fisherman before. They should take him to a doctor. Maximilian grumbled.
We don't have a doctor in the village, only Father Wilde.
Max immediately supported the old man and looked at me. Fritz, come. Hesitating slightly, I stepped closer. I put my arm around the other side of the man. He continued to moan, and only single bits of words came out of him. Something was sticking out of Max's vest. He had obviously taken the man's book. Supporting the man, we took him out of the lighthouse, and Emma guided us to his house. In front of the church square, we saw a large house, almost like a barn, next to which stood the sailing ship Henrik had mentioned. Confused, the captain called out the name of his sailor. What's going on now? I grumbled. Maggie agreed to look after the captain, while Max, Emma, and I carried old Harold Corber into his house and put him to bed. After a while, the old man was asleep and breathing heavily. Emma nervously chewed her fingernails. Shall I get the pasture? Asked Max. I wouldn't have dreamed of doing that. I would never go into a room alone with this scary man.
No, he has a strong aversion to strangers, even more so than to me and my grandfather. I'll go and get him. There's a pot of tea in the kitchen. It'll probably be cold by now, but help yourselves.
Emma explained, threw on a coat, and left the house. The rain got heavier and heavier, and I said goodbye to the idea of leaving this godless island that very day. While I was inspecting the kitchen, I noticed that the entire island had not yet been connected to the electricity. I opened the hatch of the stove and tried to light the fire inside. I slowly realized that I was now alone with the other and also very mysterious man. Maximilian Bauer seemed like someone who was keeping a big secret, a secret of the kind that should not come to light. He stood quietly behind me in front of a bookshelf and leafed through it. At that very moment, I heard the eerie roar again. It came from the direction of the sea and reminded me of the first time I heard the sounds of an industrial estate. You could help me here. Don't you realize how cold it is here? As soon as I said it, I wondered what a stupid idea that was. A big grim mountain of a man looked angrily at me and then turned back to his book. Better if he left me alone. I turned my back on him again. When the fire finally started, I heard a rumble behind me. Through the reflection in the window, I saw Max pull Harold Corber's black book out of his vest and drop it to the floor. He quickly put it back in his pocket. For a brief moment, our eyes met in the reflection of the window. At that moment, the door opened and Maggie stepped inside. "God be with you, Maggie." She immediately grabbed a towel to roughly dry herself off. The rain was obviously getting heavier, her coat was wet up to her knees, and her shoes were completely soaked. Max put one of the books back on the shelf. It had a green cover and was now on the second row of the bookshelf. He obviously kept the book with the black cover with him.
Hans Junker has obviously disappeared. What's more, although the sailing ship is still in working order, there's hardly any chance of setting sail safely in this weather. We're stuck here.
Wonderful. Stranded on an island with madmen. I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. This wasn't how I imagined it. After a short time, Emma returned with the creepypasta. He didn't speak to us. He reacted as if we weren't even there.
"I need quiet. Please go upstairs and pray for your grandfather."
Emma led us up one floor, which obviously had to be her apartment. I waited a moment until Max and Maggie were standing on the small staircase and grabbed the book with the green cover, under the pretext of using the bathroom. I retreated to a small room in the light of an oil lamp. I opened the book, which contained a bookmark. It was the writing of a clerk about the downfall of an entire town called Rungholt. He said that the sinners would now be punished and that their just punishment would come with the sound of the church bells. A list of surnames could be read, including the name Korber. I put the book back in my pocket and joined the group. Maggie, Emma, and Max sat on old wooden furniture and drank the tea I had brewed again. After some speculation about what had happened to Hans Junker, Maximilian got up without warning and walked towards the bathroom. Now it went right through me. There was a horrible scream and Emma's cup fell to the floor with a clink.
Grandpa?
She shouted and stormed down the stairs. Maggie and I rushed downstairs and saw the open door to the outside. The bed where Harold Korber first lay was empty and rumpled. Only a Bible remained on the bedside table. We followed Emma outside and horror gripped me when I saw the source of the scream. The pastor was standing in front of the gate to the chapel, a Bible in one hand and a hammer in the other. Harold Korber was lying on the floor with his limbs stretched out, but it was only at second glance that I saw what he was really lying on. The old man was nailed to a wooden cross. Pastor Wilde reached out and hammered a final nail through the man's right hand. I heard the nail pierce the flesh and anchor itself in the wood. Again he cried out in pain, gasping and sobbing.
Help."
He moaned with the last of his strength. Pastor Wilde put the hammer aside and raised a small woodcutter's axe. It flashed and thundered. With a look of madness, he shouted the following words into the night.
"The Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the earth, from man to beast, and to the worm, and to the birds of the air. I am sorry that I have created them."
With a loud scream, Emma ran towards the pasture, but he raised his axe and turned back into his chapel. I tried to grab Emma's arm to keep her out of the hands of this madman, but she slipped away. She immediately threw herself on top of her grandfather and checked for signs of life. Maggie and I slowly stepped forward. I felt sick when I saw the bloody spots in the old man's hands and feet. It was dripping and running down his arms.
"Oh, dear. I'm sorry,"
he said in a croaky voice. Emma frantically tried to pull out the nails, but Maggie interrupted her.
Don't let him bleed to death and you'll hurt him even more.
"Lord in heaven."
Joseph approached and looked in shock at the crucified man on the floor. His eyes closed. Emma held her breath and Joseph bent down to feel for Harold Korber's neck.
"I'm sorry, young woman. He's dead."
He pulled off his captain's cap, depressed. At that moment, an eerie howl sounded from the sea. The sound I had heard several times that day, only this time it made my blood run cold. It almost sounded like a creature that was being tortured. To this day, I have never seen an animal make such eerie noises.
There it is again,
Maggie said as she gasped for breath. The strange dark monster we saw in the distance. It was huge, dark, and it was getting closer. Is that a wave?
"That would be the biggest wave ever sighted. It's more than a storm surge."
the captain explained in fear. Then I remembered. The sound of the church bells, the pasture. Whatever was going on at the time, I knew I couldn't explain it, but the bells were not allowed to be rung. Emma sat sobbing next to her grandfather's body. I gently touched her on the shoulder. I can't explain this, but we have to get out of here. We have to stop the pasture. He's not allowed to ring the bells.
The bells? Are you going completely crazy now?
It was this book. I tried to explain.
My grandfather's book. That damn book.
Emma interjected.
Whatever we're up to, we should get out of here as quickly as possible. Up onto a roof or the tower,
Gasped the captain, panting with fear. Now we heard the first cries of panic from the settlement. I helped Emma up. Listen to me. We can't save your grandfather, but we might be able to save us. He didn't look at me, but nodded.
Come to the church. To the mud, man.
Maggie asked, horrified.
We're more than him.
The captain encouraged us. Luckily he did, because I didn't realize what had gotten into me at that moment. The lighthouse would have been another option, but those bells, I couldn't get them out of my head. We hurried into the chapel together. Many candles lit the room and the large cross was missing. I saw the pastor climbing up a spiral staircase. There he is. Please, we have to get him. I shouted frantically. I wanted to let my reason have its way. Church bells couldn't be the trigger for a gigantic stampede, but this feeling inside me won out. I rushed forward when I heard a familiar voice.
Stop.
Maximilian was standing in the chapel with his gun drawn, holding the book in his left hand that Harold Corber had clutched tightly to him when we found him in the lighthouse. Max, the pasture, he is—
Shut up.
He interrupted me.
I can't let you stop him,
He said in a clear voice. His eyes glared at me. I saw the same look again, but it didn't resemble that of Mr. Corber or the fisherman. No, it resembled that of the pasture.
We are witnessing an act of the gods. I and all of you will be washed clean of your sins.
I felt my heart beating faster than ever before. Adrenaline pumped through my body, and with one leap I jumped towards the strong man. We fell to the ground and a shot rang out. I clenched my teeth expecting the shot to hit me, but it missed us. I saw the gun fall next to us and tried to grab it. Maximilian, however, had no problem pulling me away from the gun and wrapped his big hands around my neck. Panicked, I gasped for breath and tried to push Maximilian away from me, but his strength was far superior to mine. I heard the screams from outside as my eyes went black and I was close to fainting. A bang sounded and blood dripped onto my face. Coughing and staggering, I freed myself and looked up. Maggie was standing there, trembling, holding the revolver in her hand. Maximilian's body lay face down on the floor next to me. Maggie. I groaned and a pain shot through my throat. She pulled me up and I looked up the stairs to the bell tower. Still coughing, I grabbed the gun and ran up the stairs. I heard a wild shouting sermon from the pasture and then a sound I will never forget. The bells above me rang with a loud peal. I clutched the gun furiously and finally reached the top of the tower. The father looked down on panicked people trying to save themselves on the roofs of their houses. I heard screaming children and a chorus of people crying, "You monsters!" I groaned.
Frederick, it was no coincidence that you were here today.
He spoke in a disturbingly soft voice.
The book. Only those chosen by God are worthy to read the Holy Scriptures and speak the language of God. It was never about the bells. It's always been about much more.
He looked at me with a smile. Trembling, I pointed the gun at his chest.
My work is done.
With these words, he threw himself down the bell tower. I could still hear his body slapping and breaking on the wet ground of the village. I breathed frantically and looked out to sea. A huge wave was approaching Hurstable, and the Ballhouse family stood trembling on the roof of their inn. Henriette held her son tightly to her. The ominous noise grew louder and louder, and the howling hurt my ears.
Fritz!
Shouted Maggie's voice. Quick, come up here. I shouted with a sore throat. I heard them climbing up the stairs and saw the first masses of water hitting the wooden dock. Groans and moans reached my ears from the spiral staircase. I saw Joseph carrying the sailor Hans upstairs. His shirt was covered in blood and he pressed his hands over a wound in his stomach, weeping.
He had hidden in the chapel and prayed. The shot that went off got him.
The captain explained to me. No, I don't want to die. Please. The boy cried. Maggie pressed a piece of his hand against his wound, but the bleeding increased. He screamed in pain and a thunderous rumble became so loud that the ground began to shake. A huge wave hit the village and slammed into the lighthouse. We watched as some houses were swallowed up in the black mass of water. We heard people pleading for help, but there was nothing we could do. The only hope we had was the stone bell tower.
All we can do is pray,
Maggie said.
No, we are responsible for this. God left us a long time ago,
Emma said with empty eyes. I saw the strange book with the black cover. She had tucked it between her skirt and blouse. A few tears were running down her face. We saw the first stretch of land on the island being swallowed up, and with it the Ballhouse family. The black monster now covered the entire sky. What I saw then still gives me nightmares to this day. The monster was alive. I saw dozens of tentacled arms and limbs writhing wildly in uncanny twitches and spastic movements. We looked at it in horror, rigid as stones and unable to move. The water flowed past the tower and the waves were obviously all the water from the North Sea, which was displaced by the creature and swept away all living things. The tower began to shake. The windows of the chapel burst and the water poured into the building. Once again, it was Maggie who saved me from dying for the second time. She points to the sailing ship. Normally, I would have said it was divine providence, but since that night, I know that there can be no such thing as the Christian God. The ship swam with the current and the waves almost exactly towards our tower.
We have to jump,
Maggie shouted. I immediately saw the panicked look on Hans' face. What? No, I can't jump. Please, I never wanted any of this. I never wanted to go to sea. That was my father. I'm only here because of him. Oh, please don't leave me alone. Don't let me die here. I knew we only had a few seconds left, and if we missed the boat, we would plunge into the raging waters. I immediately grabbed Maggie's hand and looked at Emma. She was crying and looking at Hans, urging him to try, but it was no use. He could barely stand, and even I wasn't sure if we could make it and if the ship would even withstand this storm surge. Now! I shouted, and we jumped over the torrential water. I hit the deck of the small sailing ship and Maggie landed next to me. The captain jumped together with Emma.
I'm so sorry, Hans,
he shouted as we jumped. Please don't leave me alone, he called after us, crying. The captain only just reached the deck and Emma slipped off. She held on to Joseph's arm and the water almost reached her legs. I rushed forward but slipped on the wet floor. The ship swayed from left to right and water kept lashing us in the face. I reached the captain and pulled him onto the deck with all my strength. I breathed a sigh of relief when I saw Emma pull herself up the last few centimeters. The ship swam along with the current at breakneck speed, and it was only through a flash of lightning which illuminated the horrors of that night that I saw the top of the bell tower being swallowed up by the masses of water. We clung onto anything we could grab with all our strength. The next big wave caught us, and for a few seconds we were underwater. The small ship resurfaced with a bump and I gasped for air. The only mast in the middle of the ship cracked and broke. It fell into the water like a felled tree. I squeezed my eyes shut and began to sob. There was nothing we could do but hope to escape this nightmare. I can't remember exactly how long we fought for our lives there. The waves pushed us underwater again several times, but we always surfaced again. And so it went on and on. The torture, the horror. October 12th, 1924, on the North Sea coast somewhere off Germany. We were silent for a long time as we lay on what was left of the ship, exhausted, tired, and distraught. The sea had calmed down, and somehow we escaped the storm surge and the creature that caused it. No one said a word. The captain looked out to sea, and Emma opened the strange book. She began to read it. I wanted to warn her about it, but my limbs ached and I barely had the strength to use my voice after all the water we swallowed. It was cold and wet. and we were terribly thirsty from all the salt. We swam like this for many hours until a glimmer of hope appeared. The sun rose. The sky was blue and only covered by a few clouds. Maggie looked at me, and a brief, exhausted smile crossed her face. My watch hadn't survived the ordeal, so we could only guess the time. After a few hours, we finally heard a ship's horn. I tried with all my might to stand up and waved. Maggie and Joseph did the same. Only Emma was quietly absorbed in the strange book. The Coast Guard ship picked us up. We were given water and warm blankets. Unlike us, Emma was unresponsive. She continued to read the book. On the way back, a man from the Coast Guard tried to snatch the book from Emma. She then started saying strange, incoherent things and repeating words in a foreign language. It sounded exactly like the words Harold Corber had uttered in the lighthouse last night. Her eyes now also had the same look as her grandfather's. A man from the Coast Guard reported that contact with the sloop had been broken off and that they were now looking for us. However, he didn't tell us about the creature, the pasture, or how Maximilian Bauer really died.
He was caught by a wave together with Hans Junker. May God have mercy on their souls,
Was all he said. Possible. Storm surge. Last night the sea was completely calm, except for unusually heavy fog, replied the Coast Guard man. His colleague, however, pricked up his ears.
Possible. I've heard that before.
Nobody spoke to us for the rest of the journey. I was already expecting to be admitted to a psychiatric ward on arrival. Emma was given medication to sedate her and was first picked up by an ambulance when we arrived. That was the last time I saw her. When we arrived at the harbor in the small settlement of Norden, the Coast Guard man just pointed to the beach right next to us. The sea was calm and the sky was blue. A gentle cold breeze blew past us. I stepped out onto the sand and noticed something sparkling that must have been washed up by the sea. When I reached for it, I realized that it was something yellowed, an old shard or something similar. It was the little boy Tiark's ceramic horse. Only half of it was broken and the colors were completely faded.
Fritz, come here.
Maggie said calmly, but with a sound in her voice that gave me the goosebumps. She was standing next to the Coast Guard man. They were both looking at a large stone. A storm surge mark was visible on it. Some places and islands were listed, but at the bottom it said, "In memory of Hurstville," which completely sank with its inhabitants in the storm surge of 1634. That was a really good story. I saw a comment on a recent video where someone said that they liked hearing my opinion. I love that one. It kind of reminded me of old No Sleep stuff. It had a more vintage vibe. I really liked it. I'm really sad that I wasn't able to pull off the German voice for the captain. I'm so sorry about that. I didn't want to offend an entire region with a horrible voice. So, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this one. I enjoyed reading it. There should be a lot of sound effects in this one. So hopefully I got it out in time. Ego, Volt, Anima, Vestra.